Hi, Marina. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
And we are very excited to have you here.
Great. So before we dive in, I first want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations, and I'm very grateful to be here. I work at Ankle Back Office Solutions, and Ankle provides bookkeeping and accounting services along with custom reporting and payroll. All the work that we do is cloud-based. We work with not-for-profit organizations from coast to coast to coast. And in my work every day, I see the challenges that a lot of organizations are facing, especially right now. With COVID-19 and the subsequent economic turbulence, it's been a rough year, We're hurting. But I also know that the charitable sector is resilient and can bounce back from this stronger and better. So today, I'm going to share some strategies that can help you and your organization get through these tough times and come out on the other side. In preparing for this webinar, we conducted a survey to find out what challenges not-for-profit organizations are facing right now. So big shout out to those of you who responded. You can see here on the slide that the most common challenge is a loss of revenue. The stock market is all over the place, and as a result, funders are seeing their revenue drop, and your individual donors may no longer be able to contribute at the same level. You're likely losing investment income too. And if your organization does any fee-for-service work, that may have taken a hit as well. We're also experiencing operational difficulties. As many of you know, transitioning to remote work can be very hard. It can feel isolating to go from working in an office with others to working alone at your dining table. And it can feel hard to collaborate with others when you're not in the same room. Also, there are things like logistic things like childcare, technology that come up. We're also seeing an increase in demand. If your organization works closely with vulnerable communities or first responders, the work that you're doing has become more important than ever, but you and your team may be feeling a strain from that. And if your organization relies on volunteers, you may have lost some of those folks for a variety of reasons. And it turns out that some work is really difficult, if not impossible, for volunteers to do remotely. So what can your organization do right now to manage these challenges and the uncertainty we're experiencing? There are a number of strategies. You can put some extra muscle into your fundraising and bringing more money into the door quickly. One thing that's top of mind for many of us are the government subsidies that are being rolled out. You know, wage subsidies, business loans, even rent assistance. It seems like new subsidies are coming out every week. So you'll want to make sure that you're monitoring announcements about those closely because the eligibility requirements often change. You can also ask your funders if they're willing to remove some or all of the restrictions on grants. You'd be surprised at the number of funders who are open to doing this right now or who have already implemented this change. You can also ask your board members to step up and increase their financial contributions if they're in a position to do so. And you want to ensure that you're communicating frequently and effectively. Social media can be a really effective tool for communicating with your current and potential donors. Another thing that we're experiencing right now is the forced push to embrace technology, whether we want it or not. Even if your organization was already doing some work online, we're now seeing the importance of technology for all aspects of our work. So let's talk about that. As we're finding out, using technology is key to respond to what's happening today. And it's also insurance to help you in the future if this happens again. So for most of us, this looks like moving to cloud-based tools. There are things like Zoom, Gila, QuickBooks Online, too many to name. And now's a good time to invest in these systems because even without a global pandemic, this is the way that the world is going. But I recognize that it is a big investment. So you really want to think through what's going to be best for your organization. Keep in mind that some programs may not meet all of your needs without being customized, and that customization comes at a cost. There's a lot to consider when you're looking at these changes, and it's definitely a steep learning curve, but in the long run, it makes sense. Having said that, while the world has changed dramatically, the fundamentals of stewardship have not. So you want to be communicating with your donors and making sure that folks understand the impact that their support has on your organization. You also want to get your community involved and think about how they can help shape the new direction of your organization. Ask them what they want to see, take their feedback, and implement it when it makes sense to do so. I really like social media and virtual town halls for this. I think one of the big challenges that we're seeing, though, is the move towards digital and remote programming. And the most important thing here is for you to be prepared. Many of our program staff and constituents may not have experience working with these digital tools, or they may not feel comfortable. So look for the webinars and trainings that are available. There's lots of information available online to help everyone get up to speed. And think about how you would run an in-person gathering and see what things can be adopted, like breaks, Q&As, that type of thing. You're also going to want to anticipate the challenges that your community may face. If folks don't have consistent access to technology, you need to be creative. So keep in mind that a lot of online meeting platforms, like the one that we're using today, have toll-free dial-in numbers, so a computer's not always necessary, just a phone. You're also going to want to have a backup plan in place for if and when things go wrong. You know, computers freeze, internet connections get spotty. It's inevitable. So see what kinds of backup plans you can put in place to keep things moving. Finally, think about security. Public Wi-Fi networks are not secure, so be mindful about what information you're sharing and how people are connecting. For example, if your organization provides counseling services or works with any confidential information, you need to be very careful about what you're sharing. Remember that this is also an opportunity to refresh your content. It's often harder for folks to engage when they aren't with you in person. So review your content carefully and think about how it will translate into a digital format. Again, you want to continue to solicit feedback from your community, and you can expect that there will be some iterations and some changes as everyone adjusts. On top of shifting towards a digital model and conducting more fundraising, another short-term measure that you can take is to collaborate with other organizations. By working together towards a mutual goal, your organizations are exposed to additional skills, resources, and contacts. All of those things have the potential to help further your mission and grow your audience. This is also an opportunity to showcase new events, programs, or services that your organization is involved with, which can help to increase your stakeholder engagement. And although there's an administrative component to any program, by collaborating, you're able to share these costs. And of course, cutting costs is something that we're all thinking about these days. Most of us look at reducing operating expenses first. Typically, that's because operations have more flexibility, and this can have an immediate impact on your short-term cash requirements. But you want to be really careful before tightening that belt too much. You can't deliver programming without adequate operational infrastructure, as most of us know. Many organizations will also look to cut program costs. And this can be more difficult because oftentimes your programming is paid for with restricted funds. So you have certain obligations to fulfill. But if you're able to deliver your programming at a lower cost, talk to your funders about using the surplus funds to support your operations. Again, it's amazing how many funders are stepping up and releasing restrictions on their grants at this time. In addition to some of those measures, this is also a great time to engage in scenario planning. So scenario planning involves making assumptions about the future. This is when you think about how the economic, social, and physical environment will change over time. A lot of the time, we think about scenario planning as involving hypothetical changes in the future. But for short-term planning, you want to think about specific uncertainties and different realities about what might happen in the future. Again, specificity is key here when you're thinking about the short term. So a great example of this is the restrictions on in-person gatherings that many of us are facing right now. So think about how your organization is going to handle the next 6 months to a year. Historically, organizations were often doing this on an informal basis or looking at it from, rather than looking at it from a longer term perspective, with the assumption that core programming would go on as planned. But in the last 3 months, we've seen a significant change in the way that programs can be delivered and to the pool of funding that's available. So think about what it might look like if those restrictions on in-person gatherings are extended. How will your organization respond? How does this impact your operations? What about the financial health of your organization? These are the types of questions that you want to be asking yourself during scenario planning. And the goal here is really to get you on your front foot and allow your organization to be more proactive rather than reactive. At the end of this webinar, we'll be sharing a free guide to scenario planning, which includes specific steps to help you and your organization work through this exercise. Another way that you can work towards being proactive rather than reactive is by having a cash flow forecast. If you don't already have one, now's the time to get one set up. And this is the next natural step after you've done your scenario planning. Some organizations will even set up multiple versions of their cash flow forecasts based on different scenarios. One of the organizations that I work with, we're currently playing with 3 different cash flow forecasts because there are 3 scenarios that we're trying to think through. And these forecasts will help you manage your cash, not just more precisely, but more effectively today and in the longer term. And there are some other strategies that you can use when you're looking at the longer term. So what you want to do is look at your program plans and think about how they might be impacted by different scenarios in a year, 2 years, or longer. And then you take those scenario plans and your cash flow projections and you extend them out. Again, we're talking 2 years, 3 years, even 5 years. So when we're looking at longer term plans, a great starting point is to set up a reserve fund. So a reserve fund is your rainy day fund. It's not meant to cover your routine expenses like payroll or rent. So the goal here, ideally, is to set it up and then never need to touch it. You want to ensure that it's very liquid, which means that it can be easily accessed in just a few days' time if you need it. Your reserve fund is incredibly beneficial for organizations. The disruptions that we're seeing from COVID-19 have really illustrated the challenges that organizations can face when they don't have sufficient operating reserves set aside and they don't have that sort of cash runway, if you will. So if your organization ends the year in a deficit, as many will, or if you want to invest in internal infrastructure, your reserve fund is there for you, and that's exactly what it's designed for. But I understand it can be hard to get started with a reserve fund. So what you want to do is set aside your unrestricted funds at the end of the year or at the end of a specific time period, and then have your board of directors formalize it. So it's firewalled, essentially, in your financial system and on your statements. But in terms of an amount, there's really no one-size-fits-all answer. So in addition to the scenario planning that we discussed earlier, you're going to want to perform some very careful analysis to determine an appropriate amount. And this is really where you can rely on your finance committee of your board of directors or an external partner to support you with that analysis. There are many, many other things that your organization can do so that you're well positioned to respond to future challenges. And I know that long-term planning can be really difficult. Across the not-for-profit sector, folks have way too much on their plates. We're working long hours, we're juggling work with the rest of our lives. We often find ourselves in sort of survival mode, if you will. And so longer-term planning and strategy will often get put on the back burner, and then they stay there. Again, the survey that we conducted prior to this webinar, we found that almost 75% of you who responded don't have a long-term organizational plan to manage these challenges, which can seem really frightening and stressful during times like these. But this is something that we really need to be making time for, and there are a lot of ways that you can do it. So a lot of what we're doing right now, when we're thinking about the short term, can also be applied to the long term. Again, take your scenario plans, take your cash flow forecasting, take your program plans, and extend them out. In fact, you want to have a good handle on the short-term side because that enables you to better project into the future. I'm really learning so much about the organizations that I work with right now, and I bet many of you are learning about your organizations too. What I'm finding is that some of my clients really understand the ebb and flow of their finances, while others are struggling to get an accurate picture. Some organizations haven't been engaged in cash flow forecasting or scenario planning at all, or they've been doing it on a really limited or ad hoc basis. But what I think is that this is really a wake-up call. I want you to feel confident that you can put processes in place to get a handle on these things and build resilience for your organization. So the short-term and long-term measures that I've outlined here are the things that I'm seeing work for my clients, and I hope that these are things you can apply that will work for your organization too. So with that, I think we're ready for questions now, Marina.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, so number one question that's been coming in is, my organization works with funders that don't like to see reserve funds or surpluses. And we obviously see this happening in the sector a lot. How can we go about navigating this?
Yeah, this is a really great question, and I have seen and experienced this quite a bit with organizations that I've worked for directly, doing finance and accounting in-house, and with organizations that are now my clients at Ankle. So it's really common across the sector, and it's quite unfortunate. As we're seeing, having a reserve fund is really important. So what I would say is that this is actually an educational opportunity for you in your relationship with your funders to speak to them about why a reserve fund is beneficial for your organization, how you're planning on using it, if you're ever planning on using it in the future, say for an infrastructure project, and just really helping them understand the true financial position of your organization so that they can see and understand the importance of it. One thing that I have also seen with my clients is that some of the funders who sort of impose this on their grantees, the grants are truthfully not always worth it. if the grant is for a relatively low dollar amount, but the funder is imposing this on you, it's worth having a conversation about whether it makes sense to work with that funder or not. Because the grant that you're receiving, well, of course, every dollar counts. It may actually put your organization at a bigger risk than you would be in by not having that grant. So that's my response to that, is to just talk to your funders and see if you can help them understand and get them on board.
Oh, that's helpful. And, I'm sure many of you are aware that, there's a lot of advocacy being done in the sector right now. Organizations such as ONN and Imagine Canada are doing a lot around that, those types of questions. So that's great. Okay, so I think everyone's dealing a little bit with information overload right now. You've mentioned the government subsidies, and there's updates and new subsidies and programs being announced all the time. What's the best way that people can stay up to date on those?
Yeah, that's another really great question, and I think information overload is exactly where we're at right now. So there are a few different avenues that you can use to sort of streamline and funnel the information that you're getting. Imagine Canada is really fantastic resource. Love them. So if you're not already receiving communications from them or checking out their website on a regular basis, I would encourage you to do so. I would also talk to your accountant or talk to your bookkeeper. I know here at Ankle, we're staying abreast of it. We're talking about it internally every single day and talking to our clients about it on a really frequent basis. There are also some of the larger accounting firms will send out newsletters. So KPMG, Ernst & Young, all those large accounting firms sort of race to send out communications as soon as the government makes an announcement. It's sort of like an alarm has been sounded, and they're all scurrying to get these notifications out to their clients. And you don't need to be a client of one of those accounting firms to get their newsletters. So there's a variety of ways that you can stay up to date on this without having to click through the CRA website and try to decipher all of that.
Yeah, and there's so much good, again, information overload. There's a lot of really great info being published. I did just put a link in the chat box to the Imagine Canada Government Relief Measures chart. This is one that we keep a close eye on at Charity Village, and I encourage others to as well. So definitely take a look at that. Okay, so some folks, I think, are going to be a little unfamiliar with the idea of doing a cash flow projection. So what are your suggestions on getting started with developing that?
That's a great question. I would suggest working with your in-house accountant, or if you work with a back office provider like Ankle, talk to them about getting one set up. It's typically an Excel document that you can review and update as often as you'd like. So I know what we do at Ankle is every month after your monthly financials are ready, we'll go ahead and plop those into the cash flow document, update it, and then we work with our clients to help refine the projections for future months. It's typically done on like a month-by-month basis, but for our clients who are in a little bit more of a precarious situation, for lack of a better word, we're finding that they're wanting to go in there and update it on a weekly basis, sometimes even twice a week. It's really helpful for your day-to-day planning and your day-to-day operations. And it's also really useful for your board of directors. So most of my clients who are working with cash flow forecasts are finding that their finance committees wanting to get a handle on the cash flow forecast and sometimes share the high-level results with the full board of directors. So the first step is to talk to your accountant, talk to your bookkeeper. If you don't have anyone in-house, or if you've got a volunteer doing it, maybe your board treasurer, talk to them about it. there are a lot of templates available online if you don't want to create one from scratch as well. So you don't have to start with a blank slate.
Great. And I know this isn't a fundraising webinar, so I'm not going to ask you, Flannery, to weigh in on fundraising best practices. But when it comes to forecasting and what you've seen with the clients that you're working with, how are organizations maybe starting to deal with the loss of revenue from events? We have someone mentioning that a quarter of their organization's revenue comes from an annual gala that's obviously now on hold, and I think that's very common across the sector right now. Do you have any thoughts or what you've seen happening with some of your clients?
Yeah, I have seen this happen with so many of my clients here at Ankle and my colleagues across the sector. I know that galas, golf tournaments, there's so many in-person events that we do in the not-for-profit sector that can bring in quite a bit of money and really subsidize a lot of our programming. And of course, with the restrictions on gatherings, many organizations are taking a big hit from that. So I've seen a couple of different strategies that my clients have used. One strategy has been that this particular client has gone to all the registrants and asked them if they're willing to take their registration fee or take their ticket, sponsorship, what have you, and turn it into a donation to the organization. So they're able to keep the money and use it to stay afloat during this time. So that's one thing that I would absolutely recommend is talk to your ticket holders, talk to your registrants, and see if they're willing to turn it into a donation. Could potentially offer them a discount on next year's event if they're willing to do that for this year. That would be my starting point.
No, that's helpful. We're seeing that happen as well. That's consistent with some of the things that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I'll also, sorry,
nope.
I was just going to say, I've also seen a lot of our clients see if they move to digital events. So, if you're having a silent auction, you could do something like that during a webinar. If, people are speaking or someone's giving a presentation. I think that there's absolutely an opportunity to move some of these things online. And there are also online tools that you can use that you may want to start using a little bit more, say Facebook fundraising, for example. I know that that's something I see on my Facebook feed personally a lot. So if you're finding that you're having in-person limitations, you can shift some of those things online.
That's a great point, Flannery, and I'll just touch on, and I'll put a link in the chat box in just a moment, but our next webinar actually coming up in June is going to be sharing a lot of data on Canadian fundraising trends during COVID-19 related to email marketing and online giving as well. So if that fundraising portion is something that you're interested in, you'll definitely want to sign up for that session. And like I said, I'll put that link in the chat box in just a moment. I've also put into the chat box a link that Enkel had done for us on cash flow forecasts, and they actually have a link inside that article to some templates. So I've put that into the chat box because we had quite a few folks asking about that as well. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Is there anything that you recommend that could be done with working with suppliers right now in terms of either cutting down on expenses or maybe getting some in-kind donations?
Yeah, absolutely. I would talk to your suppliers and talk to your vendors about discounts. If you haven't already asked them for a not-for-profit organization discount, now is a great time to do so. You can also, if you've got a contract, try to renegotiate it. I have a client right now who's working to negotiate down one of their contracts to help save some money there. You can also ask your suppliers if you can delay or stretch out your payments. So rather than paying an invoice as soon as you get it, typically we've got 30 days to pay an invoice, right? And so when you're looking at your cash flow forecast, you can also be looking at your outstanding payments to vendors and thinking about how you might be able to stretch some of those things out to manage your cash without negatively impacting your relationship with the vendor, of course. Yeah, negotiation's really key.
Okay. And now I know I've put this in the chat box as well, but there is the scenario building guide that Ankle has published. Do you happen to know, we've had folks asking if there's a template or something that folks can download. Does that guide walk through some of that for people?
The scenario planning document includes a lot of information about how you would develop those scenarios, but for each organization, the sort of format or the template or tool that you're going to want to use looks very different. So depending on how your organization shares information and how you run your programming, sometimes it's just a Word document. I have found a lot of success with setting up like a Google Doc, sharing it with my colleagues, and then just kind of doing like a brain dump as a first step, and then refining it as we go. Some folks prefer to start in Excel and assign dollar amounts to things kind of earlier on. It really depends on who's involved, how you're communicating, and the kind of nature of your organization. I think the most important thing is to be really clear and very detailed with the assumptions that you're using in your scenario planning. So if one of the scenarios that you're looking at is that your revenue is going to decrease by 50%, make sure you're articulating which programs are going to have a revenue decrease, which programs might see an increase. It's going to, net that out. Whatever sort of template or tool that you're using, make sure that you're really, really thinking through and really documenting the assumptions. So some of you know, I think it's the 5 whys or the 7 whys. So every time you're looking at a scenario, you want to keep digging one step deeper, keep digging one step deeper, and just continue on until you feel like you've really fleshed out the details and really understand the potential impacts of this scenario. Because it's those details that you can really kind of play around with and fine tune as you're working through your scenario plans. And then of course, once you've developed your scenario plans and how you might respond to those scenarios, you can then take that information and put it into a cash flow forecast. And for that, there are much more kind of standardized tools and templates.
Great. And now for folks that this is very new to some organizations and some folks, the whole idea of the scenario planning and then moving into the cash flow forecast, can you provide a little insight on who in the organization maybe wants to take the lead on that? Does it come from the board? Does it come from the ED? How is the best way to work together on those? Perhaps you could shed a little light on that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I think for scenario and response planning, you want to have a really big tent. You want to include as much input and speak to as many people as you possibly can, because those different perspectives and those different insights will provide you with the information that you need to really think through the different scenarios. So you want to be talking to your board of directors. You want to be talking to your executive team, your senior management team, your program team. You're going to want to be talking to your constituents or the communities that you work with, because each one of those groups will have a different perspective on what might happen to your organization, what your strengths and weaknesses are, what opportunities may be available. So I would say for scenario planning, to start, you want to cast a really, really wide net. And as you refine the scenarios and as you continue to work through them, you may find that you have enough information from your constituents to move things forward, or you have enough input from your board or your program managers to keep refining and moving these scenarios forward. And then when you're ready to start working on your cash flow forecast, that's going to look different for every organization. If you have an in-house director of finance, it likely makes sense for them to take the lead on that. If you don't, if you've got a bookkeeper or a volunteer treasurer, that's also something that they can get started on. I know here at Enkel, we work with a number of our clients who have never had a cash flow forecast before. We help them get set up with it, and then oftentimes they're off and running on their own with it. And then in terms of updating the projections in the cash flow forecast, again, that's something that you may want to speak to a number of people about. I would encourage you to listen very closely to your programmatic staff members, your program managers, if you have a director of programs, because those folks are most intimately involved with the work that your organization is doing. And of course, your programmatic plans affect the financial position of your organization. So as you're looking at the forecast, plotting out what's going to happen, thinking about what changes you might need to make, your programmatic team is really going to come in and be very useful for you.
And as folks are doing this process, obviously, most people are going to be doing it virtually right now. Do you have any recommendations for helping to enable greater participation across the board and collaboration in that virtual environment as you're doing this?
Yeah, I love Google Sheets. I love having a living, breathing document where lots of folks can view it, lots of folks can access it, you can add comments, you can make changes as needed, and you can also change the level of permissions that people use. So if you want to provide a board member with the ability to just look at it and add comments, but not necessarily go in there and make changes, you can do that. I have seen a lot of success with our clients at Enkel and with other not-for-profit organizations that I've worked with in the past with using Google Sheets, Google Docs to collaborate for both scenario planning and the cash flow forecast.
And the great thing about that is there's a lot of free,
Yeah.
free options available.
Exactly right.
Yeah, which is always a good thing.
Exactly right. Yeah.
Now, again, we're not going to get too deep in the woods into fundraising techniques here, but I had an interesting question come up about organizing online galas or virtual galas and events. You know, just that idea that a lot of charities obviously put a lot of work and effort and creativity into creating just the most spectacular experiences that they can for their stakeholders and their constituents. But you know, in today's climate, are we starting to see organizations just kind of scale down a little bit in terms of that? You know, like going forward with, say, a virtual event that's just maybe a little bit scaled back from what's been done in the past. Are you seeing that at all with your clients?
Yeah, so I know for some of the organizations that I work with, they're assuming that there will still be limitations on in-person gatherings. So there may be a cap on the number of people who can attend a specific event. And so that by nature will create a more sort of intimate and scaled down event. I also think it's hard to know what's going to happen, right? We're not sure if we'll be able to go back to larger in-person gatherings in 6 months, in a year, even 18 months or 2 years. It's obviously none of us can predict the future, so it's quite hard to know what it's going to look like. but I suspect that it will not be the same as it has been in the past. So whether that's a larger physical space to allow for greater distance in between people, whether it's smaller, more intimate gatherings with fewer people, we just don't know, but I feel quite confident that it will look different for most organizations.
Yeah, I think that's quite clear. Okay, so before we wrap up today, we've had some questions come in about staffing. Obviously, a lot of organizations are dealing with temporary layoffs, staffing issues. Just wondering if you could maybe have some comments about that, maybe how organizations are staying in touch with their staff, what their approaches are right now to that issue, what you're seeing with your clients as well.
Yeah. So what I'm seeing is that for many organizations, the transition to remote work and having staff interact virtually is going better than expected. It's a stressful time, but I know from what I've seen with my clients, some of them have actually seen an increase in productivity, which is very cool. So I think truthfully using video as much as possible is really, really helpful for staff engagement. A lot of video tools are free. I know that you can get a free version of Zoom. There's also Google Hangouts. Even Facebook, I think, has a video option. So I would encourage you when you're collaborating and when you're working with your colleagues to use video as much as possible. And we've all heard about sort of Zoom fatigue and the way that it can be kind of psychologically draining to see yourself on video and to be on video for so much of the day. But one cool thing that I learned recently is that a lot of those tools actually have a built-in feature so you can hide your own video. So you don't have to feel self-conscious. It can feel more like you're in the room with folks. So I think in-person gatherings are often ideal, but in lieu of that, video conferencing, video chat is really, really helpful for staff engagement. There are also some other changes that you can make with staffing when you're looking at cutting costs. Marina, do you know if that was maybe part of the question as well?
Yeah, absolutely. If you could touch on that, that would be great.
Yeah. So what I've seen with some of my clients is scaling back on the number of hours that folks are working, so they're able to keep folks on payroll, but cut back on the number of hours that people are working. Of course, there's also that fantastic 75% wage subsidy that we know has been extended, I think, through August at this point. And I'm hard pressed to think of any client that I work with who hasn't started working on an application for that, because it helps so much. Obviously, we all want to avoid layoffs and terminations to the greatest degree possible, but the reality is, for some organizations, that is what needs to happen. So we have also here at Ankle heard from folks who have had to reduce their in-house accounting and bookkeeping staff, and so they're looking for an outsourced back office solution. Oftentimes it is more cost effective to outsource things like IT and accounting, but I understand that that's sort of the last resort for many of us.
And for those folks that have had to look at some temporary layoffs, have you seen any good strategies in terms of staying engaged with staff who maybe aren't working right now?
Yeah. I mean, I think, truthfully, I think transparency is really, really valuable in these situations, where you can stay in touch with folks that you've had to temporarily lay off, keep them abreast on where things are at for the organization. It can be hard to give a potential timeline, but if you have done your scenario planning and you've done your cash forecasting and you are confident that your organization might be in a better position, say by the end of the summer or early fall. Be transparent about that. Obviously, you don't want to give any false hope or string people along. But I think just honesty and transparency, along with frequent communication, can go a long, long way in helping those team members feel supported and feel engaged.
Yep, that's transparency. That's that's the name of the game these days, for sure.
Yeah.
I think we're going to wrap there on questions. Flannery, did you have any final comments you wanted to make before we sign off today?
I just want to say thanks so much for having me, Marina, and thanks very much to everyone who joined. For those of you who've opted in to receive emails from Ankle when you signed up for this webinar, we'll be sending you a copy of that scenario planning guide, so be sure to keep an eye on your inbox for that. And if you didn't opt in, you'll still be able to access the guide through the link on the presentation, which, as Marina mentioned, will be shared later. If you'd like to connect or keep the conversation going, my contact information is here on the screen on the presentation as well. So I hope to hear from lots of you. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Flannery. It's been an absolute pleasure having you present for us today. And I want to thank you as well for including that contact information. We know that things are changing every day, and I'm sure a lot of folks will have questions coming up that maybe we didn't get to in the session today or that come up as they think of them later. And I encourage all of you to go ahead and reach out to Flannery and the team at Ankle if you do have questions that you need some insight on. As Flannery mentioned, we are going to follow up with you by email. So for those of you that opted in to receive communication from Ankle, you will get a separate email from them with the scenario planning guide and all of that information. But you'll also hear from Charity Village today, as usual, with the webinar recording, the slide deck, and the links to the other resources. There will be a short survey as well that will take less than 5 minutes to fill out. And if you can complete that for us, if you can, it's very helpful for us. You'll have an opportunity there to let us know about future topics you'd like to see covered in other sessions. And we'll also share the feedback with Flannery as well. I'd like to remind you all that Charity Village does have a lot of resources available to you right now, including a dedicated COVID-19 resource page. You'll find all of our information and discounts there. And I am going to pop that information in the chat box right now so that you have it before we sign off today. There you go. We'll include that in the follow-up email as well. Our job postings are currently available at a 15% discount until May 31st, and our online courses for nonprofit professionals have a $10 discount on single courses until June 30th. You can also post free volunteer and event listings, including virtual events, on our site. You can also browse our articles, webinar recordings, and listen to our weekly podcast. On behalf of Charity Village, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We do host dozens of free webinars every year, and we've actually just started unveiling our summer lineup. Our next session is going to be on Thursday, June 18th, and we'll feature Brady Josephson from Next After, who's going to share the latest Canadian data on how organizations are fundraising by email and online during this COVID-19 crisis. So we'll include a link to that in the email that we send later today as well, in case you would like to register. I want to thank you all again for taking part in today's webinar. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Stay well, everyone. Bye-bye.